Well, good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate so many people coming out on such a beautiful day, coming inside to talk about books when it's so nice outside today. I'm going to try to do three things here in the next couple of minutes. I'm going to talk briefly about Franklin Buchanan, who this guy was, what he did, why he deserves a biography, what I found interesting about him. And then I'm going to read three relatively short passages from the book that I hope will provoke some discussion. And then, for the bulk of the time, I hope we can get into some conversation involving some question and answer format here. First of all, who was this guy? Franklin Buchanan was a Marylander. He was born at the estate of Auchintorley outside Baltimore, Maryland in 1800. Always easy to figure out how old Franklin Buchanan is at any given time, because being born in 1800 means you simply have to figure out what date it is and you know his age. He spent much of his early life in Philadelphia, so his orientation in terms of the geographical distinction that was even then beginning to break down in the United States between North and South was at least as much north of the Mason-Dixon line as south of it. He entered the Navy as a teenager, as so many aspiring officers did in the Navy of the sailing era. He was 15 years old when he convinced his mother that she should use her influence to get him a midshipman's warrant for the United States Navy and serve on board the frigate Java, hoping, I'm sure, to find himself in some sort of frigate-to-frigate confrontation in the War of 1812 that was then just ending. Alas for that ambition, before he could report aboard the Java, the War of 1812 came to an end. And he felt, I think, a great deal of frustration in not having the opportunity to smell the gunpowder, so to speak, in this great naval war of his early years. That sense of adventure sort of was a constant characteristic in his early life. He was always looking for the next great thing to participate in. He was a man of action rather than a man of words, and eager for a lot of adventures, and found quite a few of them in his naval career. He spent several tours in the Mediterranean, serving on board both frigates and ships of the line in the latter days of the Barbary Wars, as the wars with the Barbary pirates, as they were called in those days, were winding down in 1816, 1817. He spent a number of years chasing, mostly without success, pirates in the Caribbean Sea. He was, as some of you in this audience I'm sure know, the founding superintendent of the United States Naval Academy here in Annapolis, Maryland in 1845. He commanded a ship and fought on shore in the Mexican War in 1847 and 1848. He was captain of Matthew Perry's flagship during the 1853 mission to Japan that opened that nation to Western trade, and in fact played a critical role, a central role, as the negotiator with Japanese envoys during that mission. Perry, during that mission, wanted to establish the idea that he was at least as exalted a figure as any of these local governors that the Japanese put forward as their representatives of the divine emperor. And therefore, Perry stayed in his cabin during most of these negotiations and had Franklin Buchanan go forth to say, well, of course you can't see the great Commodore Perry, but I may speak for him, and so forth. So he found himself, although, as I suggested earlier, here's a man of action rather than a man of words, found himself nevertheless participating in this as a diplomat as much as a naval officer. He was a member of what was known at the time as the Efficiency Board in the mid-1850s. That is a very controversial, not so much today, but then, very controversial effort to sort of weed out of the ranks of naval officers those who were considered to be, shall we say, less than fully enthusiastic or deserving of their rank. Naval officers, once they'd reached a certain position, considered their positions to be a sinecure for life. There was no mandatory retirement age in the United States Navy in the 19th century, and they just hung on like grim death. And Buchanan, being the young, eager, enthusiastic naval officer, wanted to clear out the deadwood to make way for people such as, well, himself. And he and Samuel Francis DuPont, a colleague, friend, co-conspirator, if you would, in this effort, convinced the Secretary of the Navy to convene this board to prune, as it turns out, about 50% of sitting naval officers from the ranks of the Navy Register. Well, that, as you can imagine, turned out to be enormously controversial. And in that, as in so much else in his life, what Buchanan demonstrated was that he was a man of absolutes. Things were correct, or they were incorrect, and there was nothing really in between. It was like a light switch. Ambiguity was a concept that was almost entirely beyond him. It was a comfort to him to know that there were regulations written in the books, and he could apply those regulations precisely and dramatically, enthusiastically at times, and not have to worry about the gray area in between. I think I discovered in putting together my biography of Franklin Buchanan that this perhaps may have been not only a salient characteristic of his personality, but his greatest weakness as a naval officer as well, and I'll explain why that came to be true in a minute. Now, all that I've mentioned so far are some of the highlights of Franklin Buchanan's career as a U.S. naval officer. But in 1861, he found himself confronted with this difficulty of a dividing nation, and he, as a border state resident with a kind of a foot in each geographical camp, was very much torn apart by this. I'll have a bit more to say about this later, perhaps, but I do want to mention that when he made the final decision to go south rather than remain north, he was a senior naval officer. He had reached about the highest level in the United States Navy you could reach in the Navy of the 19th century. He was the commanding officer of the Washington Navy Yard, considered a plum job in those days. And it tore him apart to consider giving that up and his commission and 45 years of naval service to go south and fight for the Confederacy. But when he did make that decision, he then found himself once again at the center of the great events of his generation. He was the commanding officer of the CSS Virginia, sometimes popularly known as the Merrimac, the converted frigate that the Confederates turned into an ironclad in Hampton Roads, and commanded that ironclad in its sortie out into Hampton Roads in the first confrontation between an ironclad and wooden warships in the history of the Navy. He then was also the commander of the Tennessee, the other famous ironclad of the Confederate Navy, in Mobile Bay in 1864. You probably have heard that David Glasgow Farragut damned the torpedoes on his way into Mobile Bay. I'm sure he had a moment or two to damn Franklin Buchanan while he was about it, because that was the action in which Buchanan came charging into Farragut's fleet, once again to challenge wood with iron. It was, in short, a remarkable life. And putting together the sequence of events in which Buchanan participated tells us a lot about the 19th century and about the 19th century Navy. But it doesn't necessarily tell us a great deal about, that tells us a lot about what he did, but a biographer's job is more than that. It's also a biographer's job to discuss and to figure out who this person was, what's inside Franklin Buchanan, what made him tick, who was he? He was, I think, a hard-working, dedicated professional with a minimal sense of humor. I think the phrase that he would have chosen to describe himself, actually pinned on him by others, but one that he would have adopted and held close to his chest, was that he was a high-toned man of honor. High-toned man of honor. But probably not a whole lot of fun, I don't think. He was a disciplinarian. It becomes very evident in reading the ship's logs and the journals that he kept when he was at sea that he considered the rules of the Navy and the rules of gentlemanly behavior to be so absolute that any deviation from those rules merited an immediate and physical response. He was a wielder of the lash. The use of the cat of nine tails was actually abolished in 1850. Sort of two-thirds of the way through Buchanan's naval career, and he always thought that was the moment when the Navy began to go downhill. For the good old days when you could drag out the cat of nine tails and really take care of business here. He was judgmental of others, others who fell away from what he considered to be appropriate behavior. They merited little sympathy. They were simply weak. If people drank, if people didn't live up to their duties, if they didn't fulfill the expectations of their seniors, they were simply weak and should be either weeded out by an efficiency board if they were officers, or whipped with a cat of nine tails if they were enlisted men. Finally, Buchanan, as it turns out, discovered, I think, maybe even to his own surprise, that he was a Southerner. as well. Never mind that he was born in Baltimore and spent much of his early life in Philadelphia and all of his adult life serving the United States collectively as an officer, often on foreign station overseas, that when push came to shove and he had to make a choice, he discovered that he was in fact a Southerner. And that derived from two characteristics in his life. And one of those, I think, helps us illuminate an awful lot about the 19th century. Buchanan lived much of his adult life on the eastern shore of Maryland. Now, those of you who are Marylanders here in the audience may be aware that Maryland's sentiments in terms of its affection for or disregard of the institution of chattel slavery were not so much divided in a gradation north to south as east to west. The further west you go in Maryland, up into the mountains where slavery really never took a foothold, the more likely you are to find people disdainful of slavery and therefore clinging to the Union in 1861. But the further east you go, and particularly across that Chesapeake Bay over onto the eastern shore, where you can see today the living legacy of slave society and some of those wonderful antebellum houses that still stand, there slavery did have a strong foothold, and particularly in Talbot County, around Easton, where Wye House still stands today, beautiful Georgian plantation house that was the property of Colonel Edward Lloyd, the sixth to bear that name in an unbroken series of masters of White House. And Buchanan in the 1830s married the daughter of Edward Lloyd, and Catherine Lloyd, known as Nanny. And as the son-in-law of Edward Lloyd, called Edward the Farmer to distinguish him from the many other Edward Lloyds of history, Edward the Governor and so forth, I believe that what happened is that he increasingly associated himself with the plantation style of life, the gentlemanly, comfortable plantation life that characterized Wye House and Talbot County in general. It was a process that took place gradually, and maybe even by 1860 he found himself somewhat surprised that it had climbed so deeply inside him. His father, interestingly enough, Dr. George Buchanan, had been a member of Maryland's Anti-Slavery Society. But his father had died when Franklin Buchanan was only 7. And Franklin Buchanan now developed a much closer association with his in-laws than he ever had with his anti-slavery father. Like his in-laws, he dropped his affiliation with the Whig Party, increasingly became a Democrat, a Southern Democrat, found Lincoln's nomination to the presidency an insult to the American public, and therefore I think slavery did play a role in the decision he eventually made to go south. The other characteristic that I think led him to this fateful decision was that he increasingly in the 1850s began to espouse in his private letters and in some of his journals references to things that were Yankee as being very negative. And what's curious about that is prior to this he'd spent most of his life as a flag-waving patriot. Overseas, when he represented the United States in Japan or the Caribbean or the Mediterranean or elsewhere that he served internationally in the Pacific Ocean, he'd always been very proud to be a representative of the United States. Yankee there meant that he was a representative of the U.S., and he was proud to be such. But by the 1850s, Yankee came to mean something else. He began to think of Yankees as kind of sharpies, people who would cut corners, who would take advantage of a deal, clever people. And he was never much one for clever people. He liked people who were forthright and upfront, who obeyed the rules, who knew what the rules were, and provided punishment for those who deviated from the rules. Clever people who cut across that corner were very much not to his liking. So he began to associate in his mind the notion that Yankees were them, the other side. I want to read 3 sections to you out of the book. The first one's going to be simply the prologue. I chose a moment that I think was defining in Buchanan's life to begin the book, and it's about 2 1/4 pages, not particularly long, so bear with me here as I read this. There's a problem with doing research with handwritten documents in the 19th century. You need these things. On Monday morning, 22 April 1861, Navy Captain Franklin Buchanan walked into the office of the new Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, in the Navy Department building next to the White House. Welles had been in the job for less than 6 weeks, but he knew Buchanan to be an important visitor, and he rose from his desk to greet him. His visitor was of medium height, with dark blue eyes and white hair that was receding noticeably above what polite individuals would call a high forehead. A few years earlier, when he had been asked to provide a physical description of himself, Buchanan had described his nose as rather large, his complexion as florid, and his face as nothing remarkable. Indeed, his features were dominated by that prominent nose and by the deep creases extending downward from it to the corners of his mouth that seemed to give him a perpetual frown. His gloomy physiognomy was especially apparent this morning, for he had come to see Welles for a special purpose, and not a happy one. On the previous Friday, 19 April, blood had been shed in the streets of Baltimore when the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, en route to defend the national capital in the expectation of imminent civil war, had been assailed by an angry mob of civilians. The Massachusetts men had arrived in Baltimore from Philadelphia at the President Street station and had to cross town to the B&O station for the trip to Washington. During their brief passage through Baltimore, a mob hurled epithets at them, then stones, then bricks. Finally, a few pistol shots had rung out. Several soldiers fell to the ground, stunned or wounded. The crowd closed in, and the panicky troops returned fire. When it was over, 4 soldiers and 12 citizens lay dead, with many more wounded. The news of this Pratt Street massacre hit Buchanan like a thunderclap. Born in Baltimore nearly 61 years earlier, he had called Maryland home for most of his life. Of course, the Navy was his home too. He had a 45-year record of distinguished service as founding superintendent of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, as second in command of Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan, and now as the commanding officer of the Washington Navy Yard. But Buchanan was a man of prompt decision, with a stern and uncompromising sense of right and wrong. To him, issues were almost never ambiguous. Men were either completely meritorious or entirely worthless. Ideas were either manifestly correct or utterly without merit. After hearing and reading about the bloodshed on Pratt Street, he decided that Maryland had been ravaged by the hirelings of a hostile and malevolent administration. There were rumors in the streets that Baltimore was about to be shelled by the guns of Fort McHenry. The state, he believed, was sure to leave the Union to join the 11 others that had already seceded. He did not wait for the fulfillment of this expectation. On Monday morning, he handed his resignation to the Secretary, saying as he did so that it was the most unpleasant duty I ever performed. Welles did not try to dissuade him, saying only that he regretted Buchanan's decision. But Buchanan apparently felt the need to explain himself. He was a Marylander, he told Welles, and under the present circumstances it was the duty of every Marylander to assist his state when blood was flowing in the streets. He had a sister and several nieces and nephews who lived in Baltimore. If he could serve his state, it was his duty to share the fate of his fellow Marylanders. He assured Welles he had done his full duty to the last. The defenses of Washington Navy Yard were in order, the guns were in good repair, and arrangements had been made for the defense of the ordnance building should it be attacked. He had even given orders to blow up the magazine rather than let the arms that were stored there fall into the hands of the insurrectionists. If Buchanan expected some expression of gratitude for doing his duty or sympathy for his moral dilemma, he got neither from Welles. The Secretary only repeated that he regretted Buchanan's decision. It was, he said, something that every man had to judge for himself. There appeared to be nothing else to say. Buchanan turned and left, returning to his office at the Navy Yard to turn the command over to John A. Dahlgren before departing for his home on Maryland's eastern shore. But Maryland did not secede. And within days, Buchanan realized that he had acted too hastily. Not for the first or last time in his long career, old Buck had acted on instinct and emotion. He tried to recall his resignation, writing to a friend that it was tendered under peculiar circumstances. Peculiar or not, Wells was not inclined to reconsider. He wanted no half-hearted patriots in his Navy. He responded to Buchanan's request with a curt note. By direction of the President, your name has been stricken from the rolls of the Navy. Characteristically, Buchanan saw himself as the victim in this drama. Thus I am forever separated from a service in which I have felt such pride, he wrote to a friend, and in which I have spent so many happy years of my life in the faithful performance of my duty. Banished from the Navy that he had served for half a century, he might have remained out of the war altogether, but that was not his nature either. He could not sit idly by while the great events of his age were determined by others. Instead, he went south to Richmond to offer his services to the infant Navy of the Confederacy. In the war that was tearing his country in half, Buchanan would do his duty as he understood it, not in the navy blue he had worn for 45 years, but in rebel gray. And I divided the book pretty much accordingly. There are two parts to the book. Part one is navy blue. Part two is rebel gray. I'm going to read you again a relatively short clipping, if you would, from each section. The first one I chose largely in honor of my colleagues in the history department who are present here today. I think you may enjoy this a bit. This refers to the period when Buchanan was acting as the founding superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy, when rules were not so clear. And remember that Buchanan was a great believer in rules. But here he was kind of making up as he went along. There were no established rules of protocol for the commanding officer of the Naval Academy, and Buchanan wasn't quite sure what was appropriate and what was not. He's going to have to figure it out pretty quickly. Classes had been in session for a little over a month when on the afternoon of the 24th of November, this is in 1845, Professor Girault, the French teacher, came to Buchanan's office and handed him a letter concerning an incident that had happened in Girault's classroom that morning. As Girault described it, the midshipmen were sitting in their seats as he walked about the classroom, calling on students at random. We've all done this. When he noticed one of them, Midshipman David Ochiltree, a 6-year Navy veteran, had his book open. Saying nothing at the time, Girault continued walking. When the next student finished, Girault called on Mr. Ochiltree, who responded with what Girault called unusual accuracy. Because he could not see if Ochiltree still had his book open, he asked him directly, "Mr. Ochiltree, is your book still opened?" Ochiltree, thinking that Girault had asked him if his book was closed, answered in the affirmative. Girault let the matter go and continued with the lesson, but at the end of class, Ochiltree, instead of leaving the room, this is the midshipman now, approached Girault and challenged him. "What right had you, sir, to ask me that question?" Ochiltree's question was prompted by his belief that Girault had stepped beyond his authority as a professor into the realm of professional honor by implying in a public place that Ochiltree was capable of cheating. Admitting that he had his book open before the recitation but not during it, Ochiltree asked for a public apology from Girault for daring to express doubt about such an issue. Girault responded by saying that Ochiltree should have had his book closed even while the others were reciting. Even angrier now, Ochiltree declared, "You had no right, sir, to ask me that question." This time it was a statement, not a question. Girault, who had another class of students filing in the door, did not want to bandy words with this young man and ordered him to leave the room. Well, Ochiltree was no more likely to accept the idea that a civilian could order him from the room than he was to admit that a civilian could impugn his honor. And he responded belligerently, "Sir, I will go when I please." But then he did leave. And after completing his next class, Girault wrote the incident up and submitted it to Buchanan. Now, Buchanan's first instinct was to support the professor and rebuke the midshipman, but before acting, he asked Ochiltree to write up his version of the event. That young man characterized the incident as a question of personal and professional honor. "Mr. Girault asked me a question which was, in a manner, impeaching my honor," Ochiltree wrote. "Girault, he insisted, had intended to convey the idea that I was reciting from a book. Heaven forfend. Even to ask the question was a slur upon his honor. Ochiltree insisted, if anyone should apologize, it was Girault. Ochiltree spoke for many of the oldsters, that is, the veteran midshipmen who were students at the Naval Academy, when he insisted that a professor's authority did not, should not, and could not extend to questions of personal honor. Imputations of dishonor, just or unjust, were simply not within the authority of any civilian. Ochiltree even challenged the authority of a professor to give an order to a midshipman. I am not aware, sir, that a professor is my superior officer and has the right to give me an order. Thought you'd enjoy that. Buchanan checked with the other midshipmen who had witnessed the event, inquiring particularly if Girault's manner had been accusatory or offensive. And satisfied by their responses that it had not, he concluded that Girault was entirely within his authority. I'll skip a few paragraphs here. That Buchanan then wrote to Bancroft to ask guidance on this, since this was going to establish precedent about the authority of civilian professors at the Naval Academy. And in his letter to Bancroft, Buchanan wrote that Ochiltree's argument was evidence of the disposition of some of the midshipmen to dispute the authority of a professor over a midshipman. As this is the first act of insubordination towards a professor, I respectfully request that an example be made of Mr. Ochiltree. You know, when I was reading this, by the way, in the archives the first time, I read that sentence and I thought, oh my God, he wants to hang him. Yet the example that Buchanan recommended was less than draconian. He asked Bancroft to write a reprimand, which Buchanan would read publicly before the assembled midshipmen. And he also asked Bancroft to rule on the key question, the authority of a professor to order a midshipman to leave the recitation room for an act of insubordination. Thank God Bancroft stuck to his guns, because we do have that authority today. Bancroft's subsequent career from the 1840s went on, as I mentioned. He participated in Perry's expedition to Japan, a kind of clash of cultures. Wonderful descriptions that have come out of that confrontation, and Buchanan's sort of uncharacteristic role as an American diplomat overseas. And then came the crisis that we've already talked about briefly in terms of his decision to go south and fight against the old flag for the Confederacy. The classic confrontation, in addition to the Battle of Hampton Roads, was the battle in Mobile Bay. And the third piece I'd like to read is a relatively short section from the Battle of Mobile Bay. This is on the 6th of April, August 1864. Out in the Federal anchorage, lookouts reported that the Tennessee was moving in their direction. The Federal fleet at this point, by the way, in the reading, has already run into the bay past Fort Morgan and is anchored. And Buchanan, deciding that honor, there's that word again, compels him to force the action, that it would be inappropriate for him merely to stand by and allow Farragut quietly to drop anchor inside Mobile Bay, sort of took the bit in his teeth, and with his one vessel, one ironclad, charged the entire Federal fleet. Well, the Federals are surprised, I guess, is a moderate way of expressing them, to see him do this. Farragut was surprised. There it is. See, I was right. Farragut was surprised that Buchanan would renew the fight so soon, but he did not hesitate to order his own vessels to clear for action. He directed them to concentrate on trying to ram the ironclad, since their guns seemed to have little effect. He ordered his own flag captain to aim the Hartford directly at the approaching vessel. Buchanan, too, sought out the opposing flagship. Like two jousters in a medieval tournament, the Hartford, at 10 knots, and the Tennessee, at 4, steamed directly at one another. At their combined speed of 14 knots, it took 15 minutes for the two ships to cover the 4 miles that separated them. Meanwhile, other Federal ships were also racing to get in on the fight. The Union monitor Monongahela was the first to close the Tennessee, Johnston, who was Buchanan's flag captain on board. Johnston saw it coming and passed the word along the deck, steady yourselves, stand by. And at the last moment he put the helm over so that the monitor would strike them at an angle. The prow of the 13,700-ton monitor smashed into the side of the Tennessee. Most of the men on board were sent sprawling by the impact, and the Tennessee was thrown off course, spinning around, one officer recalled, as if on a pivot. But it sustained no serious damage, the armored sponsons taking the blow without yielding, and Johnston was jubilant. "We are all right," he cried out, as if surprised that it should be so. "They can never run us under now." If so, it was not for lack of trying. The ships of the Federal squadron circled the Tennessee like a pack of dogs that had cornered a fox, and they took turns trying to run it down. Farragut's orders to his captains were to try to drive their ships up and over the Tennessee's flat decks, literally mounting the ship and forcing it underwater. As they did so, they also fired their guns at point-blank range into the Tennessee's casemate. The range was so close that several men on the Tennessee were burned by bits of wadding and chunks of black powder that blasted through the open gun ports. Others were wounded by small arms fire as men on the Federal ships aimed their rifles or pistols at those narrow openings. Meanwhile, the Tennessee's guns were firing as well. Buchanan left the maneuvering of the ship to Johnston, while he exercised personal supervision over the guns. The sound of the guns resonating inside the small iron casemate, the sulfuric smell of the white smoke, the heat of the engines on an August morning in Mobile, which raised the temperature in the Tennessee to over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, all combined to produce a nautical version of hell itself. The Lackawanna was the next ship to strike the Tennessee. The wooden steam frigate hit the Tennessee squarely on its port side, just abaft the beam, and the blow heeled the ram over heavily to starboard, driving the stern temporarily below the waterline. But the impact did more damage to the assailant than to the victim. The Lackawanna's stem was crushed, broken by the heavily armored knuckle of the Tennessee's protruding sponsons. After the initial collision, the Lackawanna's bow scraped along the side of the ram to a point opposite its stern. The force of the blow turned the Tennessee's head to port, so that now the two ships lay nearly parallel to one another. The gunners on both ships fired as fast as they could load from a range of about 12 feet. Men on both ships screamed insults at one another as they worked. Swept up in the fight, they used any weapon at hand. Sailors on the Lackawanna threw a spittoon and a holy stone at the Tennessee. A sailor on the Tennessee leaned out a gun port and stabbed a Federal sailor with his bayonet. Much more seriously, one of the 9-inch shells from the Lackawanna hit squarely on the Tennessee's gun port cover and jammed it half open so that it would neither open nor close. The Tennessee was down from 6 guns to 5. The two vessels gradually slipped apart, but that merely created the opportunity for yet another Federal ship to attack. All this time, Johnston had been attempting to con his ship toward Farragut's Hartford. Twice thrown off his course by the attacks of other ships, he returned each time to steady on the Hartford, which was now within close range. The two ships closed on one another bow to bow. But once again, Johnston put the helm over at the last moment to avoid a head-on collision, and the two ships struck obliquely. And they scraped past one another, the muzzles of their guns almost touching. The Hartford carried 12 guns in each broadside, and at this range they could hardly miss. All 12 shells, however, glanced off the armored casemate. For its part, the Tennessee had only 5 operational guns and only 3 that fired to port. The primers on 2 of the 3 misfired, so the Confederate gunners got off only 1 shot against the Hartford, though that 1 shell exploded on the Hartford's berth deck, killing 5 men and wounding 8. Farragut's flag captain, Percival Drayton, later claimed that as the two ships slid past one another, he spotted Buchanan through an open gun port and, overcome by fury, threw his binoculars at him, screaming, "You infernal traitor!" I don't know exactly how much to make of that. This is a post-war reminiscence. Once the Hartford slipped past, one of the Federal monitors crept up on the port side of the Tennessee. Very likely it was the Manhattan, sister ship of the Tecumseh, which had blown up by the famous mine going into Mobile Bay, which also carried 15-inch guns in its armored turret. And peering from one of the Tennessee's gun ports, Lieutenant Arthur Wharton watched in mingled awe and terror as a slowly revolving turret revealed the cavernous depth of a mammoth gun only yards from his face. "Stand clear the port side," he hollered, and a moment later a huge concussion struck the casemate as a 440-pound bolt crashed against the 5 inches of armor and nearly 2 feet of wood that made up the Tennessee's casemate. Unlike earlier shells from Federal 9 and 11-inch guns, this one opened a hole in the side of the Tennessee. Well, if you want to find out who wins this fight, you're going to have to buy the book, because that's as far as I'm going to go with that. I hope with that as a provocation, you might perhaps have some questions that we could talk about. Oh, come on. Yes?
What finally happened to Franklin Buchanan's brother, who was on the Congress?
Yeah. Franklin Buchanan's brother was also a career officer. He was what was known as a paymaster. A paymaster, they didn't let officers handle the money in those days. Probably a good decision. They had a separate rating of paymaster, and they served together only once throughout their lengthy professional careers, and that was in the Pacific in the early 1850s. And as fate would have it, Buchanan's brother was on board the Congress. The Congress was one of the two ships in Hampton Roads when Buchanan took the Virginia out on its maiden voyage to attack the Federal fleet. He was very concerned. It suggests something about Buchanan. He was more concerned that anyone might think that he was less likely to do his full duty in attacking and destroying the Congress than he was about the possible fate or future of his own brother. When his vessel attacked the Congress went into shoal waters and he couldn't ram it as he had the other ships, so they shelled it constantly throughout the afternoon until it finally caught fire, and only then, when it was completely aflame, did he haul off. And about midnight, while he and his officers were discussing the historic events of that day, the ship blew up, and Buchanan only then wondered aloud what had happened to his brother. Was he still on board the ship when it went down? But he remained the war, and after Buchanan was prisoner following the Battle of Mobile Bay, oops, I guess I just gave it away. After he was made prisoner following the Battle of Mobile Bay, his brother visited him in Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor, and they had a long conversation, and apparently became subsequently reconciled. Although reconciliation was a difficult thing for Buchanan, he was not by nature a man who forgave. Other questions? Yes, Tom.
In the end, was he a good thing for the Confederate Navy to have captured his services, or gained his services? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The Confederacy had so little in the way of naval infrastructure. What the Confederacy had, if you're measuring up those things that constitute, I'm sorry, I should probably repeat the question. Was Buchanan a great gain for the Confederacy? Was his deciding somewhat after the fact? He didn't go south until after the Battle of Bull Run. Was that decision a benefit for the Confederacy or not? The one thing that the Confederacy had in terms of naval power was a surplus of officers. They had more officers, really, than they knew what to do with. 229, I think, officers resigned their commissions in the United States Navy and went south to fight for the Confederacy. Well, according to Confederate law, there was room for only about 24 officers in their Navy. What were the other 200 to do? Many of them actually took commissions in the Confederate Army because there were simply no naval jobs available for them. What they needed were ships more than they needed officers. But I think Mallory, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, was quite happy to get Buchanan to serve on his part. He gave him immediately the highest administrative position available to him in the Confederate Navy, that is Chief of the Bureau of Orders and Detail, where he played the role more or less of what we would call the Chief of Naval Operations today, the administrative head of the Navy. And the greatest gift that Mallory had in his command was command of the Virginia. The Virginia, this ironclad, case-mated warship, the Confederacy poured a disproportionate amount of its wealth and assets and hopes into the future of this one ship. And Mallory thought long and hard before he decided the man he wanted to command it. He wanted a man who would take risks but remain responsible, who would enforce discipline, but also accept authority. And he was very clear. He went out of his way. He had to kind of circumnavigate the command structure to get Buchanan in that command position. So Mallory believed it was very important to the Confederacy to have Buchanan there as the man who could make the most of this experimental warship. It's kind of interesting to look at the orders, by the way, that Mallory gave Buchanan for that sortie. What he was hoping was, is it possible, you can almost hear the desire, the hope in his voice, that you could take this ship out of Hampton Roads into the Chesapeake Bay, steam upriver, up the Potomac, and take the White House under fire. Buchanan had to throw cold water on that almost immediately. This ship, a 23-foot draft, top speed of about 5.5 knots, we're not going to be able to do that. But Mallory was not the only one who thought it might be possible. The day after the Battle of Hampton Roads, in which Buchanan participated, Lincoln was hosting a meeting in the White House, and about every 10 minutes he got up and went to the window and looked downriver to see if the Virginia was on its way up the bay. In the end, I'm not sure that he added much more to the Confederacy than it didn't already have. What the Confederacy had was a surplus of officers of will, enthusiasm, purpose, and determination. What they didn't have was ships. And in the end, of course, that's what undid their effort to try to compete effectively with the Union Navy in the Civil War. Yeah.
Well, to make you what if,
here we go.
Historians do not want to do. You just talked about how Mallory wanted him to command the Virginia, and he did in the Battle of Hampton Roads, but in the engagement between the Monitor and the Virginia, he did not.
Right.
So.
Right. So why, you're asking?
Well, I guess he was injured.
Yes, he was. He was wounded, and it's very characteristic in the way that happened. Not to make too much of a story of it, I do want you to buy the book, after all. He found himself in a circumstance where he felt that the Federals were behaving like you would expect Yankees to behave, you know, irresponsibly, dishonorably, continuing to fire after a ship had been surrendered, and he was so outraged by this that he went to the ship's weapons locker and took out a musket, climbed up on top of the ironclad casemate where he was nicely silhouetted against this, and began shooting, you know, with this rifle. Well, people shot back, and down he went, wounded, which took him off, of course, the historic map just at the moment when the Virginia was about to fight its most famous confrontation with the ironclad Monitor, which would arrive that night. But what this says, again, is a lot about Buchanan's personality. They're not behaving by the rules. I guess he shouldn't have been surprised that Yankees would not behave by the rules, but by God, you know, rules are rules, and that's, I think that's kind of what he was all about. Others? Yeah?
What did he do in 1863? Or second half of 63?
Well, his injury was very significant. He was out of, you know, the bullet passed through his hip very near his femoral artery. It was feared that he might bleed to death. He went to a hospital. He never walked without a limp for the rest of his life as a result of that injury. So it did take a long time for him to recover. Once he did recover, he was immediately sent down to Mobile Bay in 1863. And what he's told by Mallory is, build an ironclad fleet there in Mobile Bay that will allow you to charge out into the Gulf of Mexico, take on the Federal blockading fleet, and destroy it. This is a real challenge for Buchanan. I mean, he had energy, he had enthusiasm, he had determination, and he bullied and cajoled and pleaded with all the suppliers, but the Confederacy simply lacked the industrial infrastructure to build a fleet of ironclads. In a way, it's a testimony to his great determination and skill that he managed to build one. That's the Tennessee. And even then, that's kind of an adventure, and there's a whole section about, you know, the problems he ran into, and things caught fire, people went on strike, and couldn't get the suppliers, and so on, and here he is, you know, bully-ragging people to get things done, but he finally gets this ship done. At last, I have it, one ironclad. You can see why he's, by golly, going to do something with it this time, right? Unlike the Virginia, where he's removed from the historical stage just at the moment of its greatest opportunity, now he's going to be on stage when he fights the Battle of Mobile Bay, and he did. So he spent most of 1863 preparing for 1864, I guess is the best way to answer that question. Anybody else? Yes?
What's the effect on the Union Navy when he gives word that he's turning in his paperwork, the morale on the fleet?
He was not the only one. I mentioned there were 229 officers who went south. Now, he's among the most senior. And the other thing is, he's not really from a seceded state. So this is difficult. But I will compare Buchanan's behavior with that of two other Marylanders, for example, who resigned, who were sympathetic with the South. One you've all heard, most of you have heard of, I suspect, that's Raphael Semmes. Raphael Semmes, who became a rear admiral in the Confederate Navy, was also a Marylander, and he resigned his commission in the U.S. Navy, went south to fight for the Confederate Navy, even before Fort Sumter. I mean, he was down there immediately, because his was an ideological commitment to the South. So he was enthusiastic about going to serve the South. The other that I'll compare it with was Isaac Mayo, another Marylander, who felt that the government, by trampling on the rights of its citizens, again offended by the Pratt Street Massacre on the 19th of April, 1861, wrote a letter asking to resign his commission, and got the same kind of curt note back from Wells saying, you can't resign, you're fired. You know, your name is stricken from the list. We don't want half-hearted patriots. If you're not with us in this crisis, then you don't deserve a commission. Well, this was such an affront to his sense of honor and personal dignity, he killed himself. Buchanan waited 6 months in a kind of a hiatus of torn, decision-making before he finally decided to go south. So all of this time there are others, dozens of others, who are making decision, yes or no. Farragut, for example, who had been born in Tennessee and spent much of his life in Louisiana and Virginia, was more oriented to the south, arguably, than Buchanan was, but it never crossed his mind to resign his commission. He stayed loyal. So there were hundreds of officers who were going through this all the time. And Buchanan probably didn't have any greater impact on that crisis of conscience than most other officers did at the time. But it was duly noted, to be sure. Yes, sir.
When the war was over and he came back to Easton area and resided there, was he accepted then by some of his former compatriots in the
Well,
Navy?
sure. This is the Eastern Shore where, the Confederacy lost. Darn. There's a great sense of, on the Eastern Shore, that the Confederacy had fought the noble fight, the good fight, the honorable fight, and had only been overcome by sheer massive numbers. So he was very much a local hero. I should mention, perhaps, in this audience in particular, that he'd lost his pension because he'd resigned, he'd been stricken from the list, and he'd been effectively a traitor to the United States government, so he had to make a living. And he did what many other Confederate officers did. He sold insurance for a while, or headed up an insurance company. But he also took a job as president of what was then known as the Maryland Agricultural College, and which is today known as the University of Maryland. And typical to Buchanan, he had a faculty of 4, and in the first few months he fired 2 of them. For not living up to the high moral tone that he believed was appropriate for a professor at the state's university and the Board of Trustees. And he did it, moreover, without even notifying the Board of Trustees. He just did it. And the Board of Trustees said, "I'm sorry, you're over the line. Don't do that again." And what would he do? You know him by now. He resigned. How dare you? And back he went to the Eastern Shore. But he became then a gentleman farmer on the Eastern Shore. He was very much honored by his neighbors. Remember who his neighbors are, the Lloyds. They think he's terrific. So yeah, he did have a lot of support and was considered a local hero. Lived until his 74th year and died more or less peacefully in his bed, and is buried in the family cemetery behind Wye House on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And that probably seems like a good place to stop, since we've got him dead and buried. Thank you very much for coming out today. I appreciate it. Water. Good. Now the next thing you do is go to the counter with all of those. A Visa card. Am I doing this right? Okay.
The research.